Welcome to The Shadow Knows, a podcast where we journey into the depths of psyche, mystery, and transformation. Hello, I'm Klara.
Hello, and I'm Maureen. Together, we're going to explore the hidden forces shaping our lives, relationships, and our collective story.
And for our very first episode, we're honored to sit here with James Frazier. He is the country's most experienced breathwork facilitators. For nearly 4 decades, James has led experiential workshops using holotropic breathwork and non ordinary states of consciousness.
And alongside that, he's maintained a private practice in Jungian coaching for 30 years. And for the past decade, he's been training others to step into this profound work as both breathwork practitioners and Jungian coaches like Klara and myself. So throughout this series, we'll be joined by James again and again as he guides us into shadow work and the depths of Jungian psychology.
And in today's opening conversation, we will hear James's story, how he came to breathwork, his decades of experience with Jungian coaching, and why exploring the shadow is so vital for transformation. James will be walking with us as we continue to explore these series together.
Okay, so settle in, everybody. Take a deep breath and join us as we open to the shadow knows.
Okay, James, welcome. For listeners who may not be familiar, can you explain what neo-shamanic breathwork is and how it differs from other breathwork practices?
Sure. Well, neo-shamanic is an outgrowth, in my case, of doing holotropic breath work. So it's essentially holotropic breath work plus, not holotropic breath work minus. But I practiced holotropic breath work for, as you mentioned, almost 40 years. But at a certain point, I realized I really needed to come up with a different name, partly for some trademark reasons, but also mostly to adequately describe what I had done with the work. I had changed the breath work, but I had added the Jungian sensibilities and Jungian roadmaps, especially neo-Jungian maps of developmental processes. So essentially, the short answer to this is that neo-shamanic breathwork is a non-ordinary states of consciousness technique. Again, it's in the tradition of holotropic breathwork developed by Dr. Stanislav Grof, but it is a synthesis with my attempt to blend these two together. It just broadens the perspective so much more and is so much more efficacious.
Yes, thank you. So what would you say it's the most common misconception people have about breathwork? And is there anything that you would like to clarify?
Well, there are a lot of misconceptions about breathwork, I think, today because there's a plethora of breathworks that just seem to proliferate daily. Some of them are copies of holotropic breathwork. Some have nothing to do with holotropic breathwork. Some are probably copies of holotropic breathwork, but have been so altered that they now no longer have anything to do with breathwork. It's a process that looks quite easy. And so I think one of the misconceptions of it is that it's not something that you should have all that much difficulty doing at home, for example. There are people who think they can do this on their own. And that's a very, very bad misconception. It's a process that should be done in sacred space with a trained ritual elder, someone who has gone through an extensive training program, because there is a lot to this work. Breath work tends to focus on trauma and trauma release, and sometimes people get the idea that that's the only thing it does. I am not of that opinion, but that would probably be the other main misconception that I might offer, is that it's not quite as limited as some people might think.
You also mentioned that this neo-shamanic breathwork is working with people in non-ordinary states. Can you tell us how working in non-ordinary states support the inner exploration and shadow work?
Well, we should probably try to define shadow in one sense, but it is a difficult concept to grasp initially. In one sense, we could use the word shadow to mean anything in our unconscious. And of course, these days, that concept of the unconscious has entered into popular vernacular, not always properly understood, but nevertheless, it's not a word that's all that foreign and unusual. 150 years ago, it was pretty foreign and unusual. So we throw around the word the unconscious like we really know what it is. What attracted me to this work was the potential for non-ordinary states of consciousness initially to do trauma work, because I was working in the addictions field and had become quite dissatisfied with the cognitive behavioral therapy that we were using. Not that there was anything wrong with it, it just didn't go deep enough. And when I accidentally discovered holotropic breathwork and then met the founder, Stanislav Grof, it opened up gigantic doorways, because in the non-ordinary state, material that Freud would have called repressed, has the potential for surfacing and also being released. So that was my initial attraction. It also held out the possibility for people having experiences of their deepest self, or what many people would refer to as spiritual experiences. And although I had begun to have a bit of a language to talk about that, I didn't have any kind of methodology. And most of the work I was doing in the addictions field was essentially relying on 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous for people to develop their spiritual program. But that left me with sort of shaking everybody's hand and saying at the end of our treatment program, I hope you have a good, powerful spiritual experience in AA. Good luck. Because I had no methodology. But with holotropic breathwork, suddenly the unconscious becomes available. Often people have experiences for which they themselves describe as being spiritual, or transpersonal is a word we also use. It's a very, very broad thing to try to talk about very, very quickly, but it goes way beyond simply talking about something. To have the experience of something, particularly something that has been repressed in the way of a trauma, and to release it in the process of fully experiencing it is quite different than just merely talking about it. So the results are pretty impressive. And then the more I studied Groff's work, the more I studied all of his material around the big birth trauma that we all go through, the more I became convinced of its efficacy. And I just basically walked away from the addictions field and started doing nothing but holotropic breath work. There was just radical, for me anyway, personally. And again, I'm not knocking the folks that work with addictions, because they are incredible people and they do some fantastic work. But at the end of my time in the addictions field, I was working with people who had very severe traumas and very, very traumatic histories, and simply talking about it was not deep enough. Whereas the experiential work allowed you to go farther and actually experience radical change.
So, James, can you share a little bit about your journey, how you first discovered breath work, and what drew you to the Jungian psychology? Mainly, what inspired you to combine then breath work and Jungian coaching?
Well, I always tell people I accidentally found breath work. That's sort of true. I was attending a conference, and there was a lady there who was quite well known in the addictions field who had just discovered breath work. She was all excited about it, and she started sharing it with me. She herself had a pretty good network of people, and she had actually begun offering holotropic breath work sessions. And when she started talking about it, a couple of things piqued my interest, but the main thing was the potential for releasing trauma. And as I said, I was already sort of dissatisfied with the gigantic gap in my particular case of the people who were actually recovering from addictions that I was working with, and what the marketing folks in the front office said were recovering. And so I was on the lookout already for some alternative, and breathwork seemed to have a lot going for it. So 2 weeks later, I found myself at a workshop, and I had one of the most powerful experiences of my life. And I absolutely knew after that first experience that I wanted to learn how to do this work. In those days, there was no training program, but basically you just started following Stan Groff around and doing all the workshops that he was beginning to do at that time. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time to get connected to him. So it was a bit of an accident, but it was again something I would say, questing for. And then I had the great good fortune of being asked to be one of the early facilitators with Groff and his work, and worked with him for 4 or 5 years. And then I met the person who was to become one of my main mentors, Ron Herring. And Ron Herring introduced me to the person who I absolutely credit with introducing me to Jungian psychology and the depths of Jungian psychology, and that was Robert Moore. And when I began to just vaguely, even at first, grasp the profundity of that model and of Jung's work, and I began to notice the connection between these two, particularly in the area of initiation, this process whereby people go through radical change, that I dove headlong into a study of Jung, and that has continued ever since. And for about 10 years, I was just doing nothing but holotropic breathwork workshops, meanwhile studying Jung, deepening in that work. And after about 10 years, I began to respond positively to people who were asking me to do individual work in addition to the workshops. And that's sort of how it began. With every decade, it has become more obvious to me that this is a perfect marriage, that there are many things that the Jungian model help us understand and work with that go even beyond the Groff model and breathwork. But I've never left the Groff model and breathwork, because that's the experiential component that's often missing in many therapeutic situations. I don't want to give everybody the impression this is therapy. in the traditional sense by any means, but it is a very powerful process of self-exploration, and it is deeply connected to a lineage as old as shamanism.
You talk about the connection between the experience and then Jung's work. And since our channel is called The Shadow Knows, how can a participant in neo-shamanic breathwork experience the shadow? Or how can it, do you have any, or do you remember any examples from your own workshops, or maybe even from your own experience?
Well, yes, certainly. And I would start by just going back to an earlier definition that I talked about. The shadow could be anything in the unconscious. And so breathwork is a direct experience of the unconscious, but you also have the conscious present, which is something very, very rare in one sense. I mean, we spend a lot of our life unconscious. If you think about it, our consciousness is only in sort of blocks of time. Most of us can only manage about 12 hours of consciousness in a day. And then we have to go to sleep. And the definition of sleep is we're not conscious. The ego is not present. Something is still operating because it produces these incredible, fantastic things called dreams. And you can learn through dream work, and this is what some of the early pioneers like Freud and Jung were doing, was using the dreams as investigatory techniques to try to map out this whole area of the unconscious. They happen to have very different views on it. If you look at the Freudian view that the unconscious is produced by consciousness, through the mechanism of repression. Theoretically, if you weren't repressing things that were incompatible with your consciousness, or that were too traumatic for you to stand to have in your consciousness, that got repressed, you probably wouldn't have an unconscious. But Jung, particularly because of his early experience as a psychiatrist, not a neurologist, and having worked with people in extreme states of consciousness, and also I frankly think Jung was better read, Jung really truly believed that the unconscious was the matrix out of which consciousness arose, not the other way around. So that's a really radical shift. But when you have an experience of something like breath work and you actually experience your own unconscious, for one thing, it's no longer just a term or a concept to you. It's actually becomes, if you do enough of it, especially, it becomes quite evident that there's this gigantic unplumbed area of even your own personal unconscious, much less the collective unconscious, that I think the breathwork does a fantastic job of introducing you to that fact that you have an unconscious and that there are contents or living contents in that unconscious. So in that sense, it begins to open you up to the possibility of something like shadow work. Now, if you add Jung's differentiation around shadow work to that understanding, you may very well begin to see that some things that you would experience in a non-ordinary state are actually your shadow, even though that experience at the time didn't necessarily tap you on the shoulder and say, oh, I'm your shadow. So, for example, if you, and you can experience this in dreams as well, but let's say you had an experience, and in the experience, you were in a dangerous part of town and you were being chased by a motorcycle gang, and they had machetes, they were chasing you, and you were terrified of your life. Well, that's interesting and scary and frightening, and maybe we might even call it a nightmare. But if you actually do work with that, you find out that, well, it's very possible that that motorcycle group is representing some aspect of your shadow. And in the dream or in the experience in the breath work, that imagery is coming to you to show you that there is some part of you that the ego itself is defended against, that you're afraid of. So in that sense, it begins to open you up to what is shadow. And then even beyond that, you begin to open up to discovering your shadow, not just in experiential processes such as holotropic breath work, but actually in everyday life. You learn about the process of projection, where unowned aspects of ourselves we tend to project out onto the world, and we see it in front of us. So we meet our shadow every day in the form of conflicts in relationships, in the form of things we're very judgmental about. It's like this doorway opening, but it's not just limited to experiences you're doing during the breath work, but it is certainly one of the major things that help me have a much, much broader view of my own psyche and then the dynamics and structure of the psyche itself.
This sounds like holotropic breathwork, neo-shamanic breathwork, can be almost viewed as a bridge into the unconscious and starting to understand the language of the unconscious. And I know, at least for myself and for many other of my participants, those journeys and experiences in breathwork are not always visuals, and I feel like this may be misconception of people going into the process, that they have to have a visual. Would you say that the shadow can manifest in the process even as can be felt, forms of feelings or emotions? And for example, with me, it was just pure frustration in my very first experience.
Often the experiences, in fact, mine particularly, were almost all somato-emotional release. And many of them go back to my own birth trauma, which happens to have been an unconscious birth because I was given ether at birth. So ether knocks out the child, it knocks out the mother, pulled out with forceps. There is no visual. And of course, reliving birth trauma is not necessarily like watching a VCR movie anyway. It's very possible that things like the unlived life, for many people, it's anger, for example. There are many people who, either through their lack of development or the taboo against it in their particular environment they grew up in, then all the anger goes into the shadow. And then suddenly you're doing a breath work and it starts emerging. Suddenly you're noticing that you're pounding your pillow. And it was kind of unusual for you, and you're banging away and you're releasing it. And afterwards, you feel this real release. So yeah, it's definitely possible for repressed material to be converted to somato-emotional and release that way. Very, very common. You know, if you've repressed anger all your life and you get angry, you don't necessarily remember every single incident as a separate event. It's like you just keep putting this anger in a big bag, and then once it comes out, it's all sort of undifferentiated.
Mhm. So you have revealed many different ways that, unconscious patterns could reveal themselves in our everyday lives. And perhaps this is, what we're talking about when we speak of shadow. But for someone who's new to breath work, what advice would you give them, especially one who feels a little resistance or perhaps afraid?
Well, first, I would try to assure them that that's very normal. The relationship between the ego, and I'm using the ego in the sense of the center of consciousness, as Jung would use it, our center of awareness, the thing we call I. That very structure is built to defend against the unconscious. That's how it comes into existence. Otherwise, you'd just be one big soup of unconsciousness. So there's a little bit of a problem right there when you start talking about exploring the unconscious. You have to have a little bit of bravery, but you also are going to experience some fear, just fear of the unknown, if nothing else. It's some of the safest work I've ever found. And it's a way for people to learn to start dealing with fear and not allowing fear to stop them, but to go through fear. So even after 40 years of doing this, I always feel a little bit of anxiety when I start to do a breath work. You would think after 40 years I'd be completely over it, have no fear whatsoever. It's something that you can go through, and then even using the breath, utilize just consciousness of my breathing to help me move through fear, not the non-ordinary state of consciousness like holotropic breath work, but just if I had to have a difficult phone call, for example, or I had to go talk to my boss or something of that nature, that I could just do a couple of minutes of just thinking about my breath, just consciously connecting with my breath. And somehow that helped me move through the fear. So they're deeply connected. I've had very, 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 very few people who could not do this work because they were too afraid. And I mean, I'm talking less than a handful in 40 years. It occasionally happens, but for most people, it's the initial amount of fear. And once they start doing the breathing, it's like the process takes over and they're able to move through things that they were not able to do in their normal everyday life. So that is one of the essentially advantages of it. If you think of trauma as something that needs to be fully completed consciously in order to be released, which is what the Groff model is about, then it's usually the fear that stops us. We don't go all the way through that. Someone might have a trauma, for example, and it keeps popping up in their life in the form of discomfort or even full-blown panic attack in some people's cases. And yet, in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, they're able to go through it in a way that they can't in their normal state of consciousness. And thus the releasing happens. So it's sort of like having a VCR tape that you ejected because the movie got so bad, but then that tape follows you around, and every time it gets near a tape player, it threatens to start playing again because its goal is to get it completed. Breathwork is kind of like consciously putting the tape back in and having supportive environment around you to help you complete the tape and release it.
So would you say then that breath work could also be defined as doing shadow work?
Well, I usually try to differentiate that a little bit, although again, used in the broadest sense, yes, of course. It's often these traumas prevent us from doing things. Fear prevents us from doing things, for example. Many of us have fear complexes that can start from trauma. You were talking about the body earlier. You know, I'm a person who has direct experience of this. When I was 3.5, I got run over by an automobile and spent 30 days in traction. I kind of left the body at that point. You know, when you have that much pain and that young, early experience, you tend to disassociate. Much of my work over the years has been trying to reconnect with that. I don't mean I was walking around spaced out. I just mean that I was not as aware of the body, paid more attention to the mind, for example, that mind body split. But in broad sense, yes, I think you could absolutely say that. Now, I do try to differentiate it in the sense that I do other kinds of work that's not a non-ordinary state of consciousness around shadow work, some of which I learned from Ron Herring, I mentioned earlier. Some I do in individual Zoom call type work with people. Some are exercises you give people. Sometimes we can through having some very powerful experiences, again, that door gets opened up and then we become more comfortable with shadow work and you start looking around for your shadow. And then if you aren't paying attention to it, it'll come looking for you in the form of dreams, bad experiences, dysfunctional relationships. There are all kinds of ways we can become aware of a shadow. So I don't want to give people the impression that breath work is the only way, but it is an enormously powerful and effective way to become aware of the contents of the unconscious, with which
Mhm.
shadow would be a big part.
James, that kind of brings me a question that I want to ask because you spent the past decade almost training others to become breathwork practitioners and Jungian coaches. And so, what do you see is the most important lesson that you hope your students will carry forward?
To keep working on yourself. The second thing is to develop a deep understanding of the process of initiation, because this is really truly the process of change. And we are constantly being called for to go through these initiations throughout life, even in a culture that no longer provides ritual process or culturally understood processes of transformation, such as the so-called puberty rites of passage. Most of our rites of passage have degenerated into more or less ceremony. We don't really do much ritual process anymore, or what I call co-creation of sacred space. So developing a deep understanding and awareness of that sacred space and their role as a ritual elder in helping others and facilitating that process is the most important thing to learn. You can learn all kinds of
Okay.
techniques, but that one is, to me, right up there. And so,
And I'm sorry.
well, I was just going to add, this is one of the problems we see with kind of exploding plethora, as I mentioned earlier, of people offering these kind of events and workshops who are not actually properly trained. Often they don't know that, and that creates often liminoid space versus liminal space. Liminal space means that it's potentially healing and can be healing. Liminoid space means it's space that looks like it's healing, but it's actually not. And I can give you some extreme examples of this, but if you get a group of people following somebody who then convinces their whole uh, flock to drink the Kool-Aid containing the cyanide, that's not liminoid. That's liminoid space. That's an extreme example of it. I realize that. But those awarenesses of initiation, sacred space, the need to continually work on yourself is, I think, the three most important things I would say, and the things that I emphasize the most.
Okay. And so, would you want to reveal your own shadow work technique?
You mean my own shadow or the shadow work
Well,
technique?
in your own inner process, in your own inner work, is there a specific shadow work technique that you do for yourself to be constantly reminded of your own shadow and working on it?
Well, I do a number of different things, but usually, of course, it's when painful things start happening to me, particularly in relationships. And once you do this long enough, you can get to the place where you catch yourself and you start asking pretty important questions like, how much of this is caused by me? This conflict I'm having. It may initially be, well, I'm totally convinced it's outside of me or it's totally that person's problem. But usually, if I'm honest and I ask myself the question, well, what's my shadow in this? Or I meet somebody who I really don't like at all. I mean, initially, and I have no reason not to like them. I just don't like them. They're just like oil and water. It's always a better exercise for me to go, well, I wonder if they're showing me my shadow. And quite often they are. So a group of people that you might get very triggered by when you see them, it's very useful to ask yourself the question, what qualities trigger me? And is that my shadow I'm looking? Because quite often the shadow is looking to be conscious in a sense. It's looking for a lived life because it's in some ways, Jung's definition of the shadow is the unlived life. Now we can do negative shadow as well as positive shadow. So if I find somebody I dislike, that's one way of doing it. But if I find somebody who I really admire and I put them on a big, huge pedestal above me, that's also a real tip off that I've projected some of my unowned life onto them. So, for example, if I find an artist and I just think their work is just unbelievable, it's just like, oh my goodness, I could never do anything like this. It'd be a useful question to ask yourself, well, what am I doing with my creativity? Have I pushed some of my creativity into the shadow? Does it need to be brought forth? This is especially true around things like power. If you find yourself in a room with somebody you inherently feel like you have less power than they do or less agency than they do, you ought to ask yourself, am I giving them my power? Do I need to pull it back? So there's a variety of ways you can look at it, both negative, what we call negative shadow, or those traits that we find very undesirable, but the other ones are traits that we've never really fully owned. Again, I mentioned creativity. Maybe you grew up in a household where you were in your room and you drawing your little drawing and you came out, it was a farm scene, and you came out to show your parents your creativity. You've got your little divine self there with your creation. And one of the parents says, get out of the way. I'm watching the television. You're in the way, which is kind of shaming. And then the other one looks at your picture and says, well, you stupid idiot. Don't you know that the sky is not red and the barn's not blue? The barn is supposed to be red and the sky blue. And so instead of getting a blessing, you get a shaming. Well, the internalized message can be, boy, that creativity stuff is dangerous. I better push that in my shadow. The issues of shame and shadow just are so enmeshed that it takes us another whole recording to do that part. But there are a variety of ways, but just trying to maintain consciousness around what my part of any given transaction is, particularly the unpleasant ones. Does that answer your question? I hope.
I think so.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So if there's one insight from your work that you would hope our listeners can take away today, what would it be?
Well, I hope they get intrigued if they have not done shadow work with the very concept of doing shadow work, because on some level, it's some of the most important work that anybody can ever do. If we could have more people become aware of their shadow and thus not need to project their shadow, we could reduce the problems between humans greatly. This might be a fantasy of mine, but we might eliminate something like racism, for example, where whole groups of people are demonized just because their skin color is different than ours. I could go on and on about breathwork and all the things I've seen with breathwork, and I think it's fantastic. But ultimately, leading me to Jungian sensibilities and to working with shadow is one of the most important aspects of it. We're really taught not to own our shadow. We'll be shamed about our shadow. That's somehow responsible for part of our initial shadow mechanism, anyway, pushing things into the shadow because we're shamed about them. When I was in my early elementary school experience, I wasn't like most of the boys. I wasn't nails and snails and puppy dog tails. I wasn't rough and tumble. So all of my aggression wound up in the shadow. So it took a lot of inner work for me to learn how to get in touch with that and learn how to actually do something like clean anger, for example. Be able to tell somebody with a straight face and without going over the top with explosive raging that what you just did made me angry, and here's what I want you to do about it, which is the formula for clean anger. There's so much that can be done with shadow work. It's not a process of always acting out the shadow, and in fact, that's one of the best reasons for doing shadow work, because if we don't act it out, we tend to act it out unconsciously. Everybody in this audience can think of someone they know who, harangues on about somebody who does something when they themselves are doing it. It's the person who just talks about so and so and what a big, huge gossip they are. Meanwhile, they're gossiping right as they're right in the middle of complaining about the gossip and completely unaware of it. So, to become more self aware and to become more whole, shadow work is just critical. It's just some of the most important work we can ever find, and one of the greatest contributions I think Jung ever made.
Well, they become aware of their gossip when Miss Bossy Britches, such as myself, points it out to them because
Well,
everybody else is bossy and I am not.
see, I got really, really fortunate because when I first became a counselor, it was working within the field of addictions. And I was seeing all this stuff. I didn't know how to have a framework to put it in. But one of the hallmarks of the most successful program for treating addictions is Alcoholics Anonymous. And Alcoholics Anonymous is a lot of things, but one of the things it absolutely is ownership of shadow. You won't ever hear that word used at an AA meeting, I don't think, but that is exactly what they're doing. And of course, they came out of a religious group called the Oxford Group, which sort of pioneered this in a way of public confession of one's faults, not going to church all dressed up nice and appearing to be perfect, but actually going to church and talking about one's character defects. And that somehow seems to be the secret to people getting sober. Well, that's the reason, because they no longer have to run from their shadow. They're no longer projecting their shadow. And so it took me years to understand that. I wish I had gotten it a lot sooner, but I'm deeply, deeply grateful for that early experience. So we also tend to become more compassionate when we own our own shadow, when we realize we're not perfect, and also have less shame. If I can actually own my shadow and truly own it, I'm less likely to act it out unconsciously.
Mhm.
And some of my shadow I need to actually incorporate. Like I say, I might have something like creativity in my shadow. I could definitely use to pull more of that out of the shadow and express it in more conscious ways.
James, I remember my very first workshop with you, and you mentioned a little bit, just like probably in this episode, about Jung's work and about Graf's work. It was just so fascinating to me. And it started off me on my own inner journey and inner work. And it was my own initiation at that time. And so that is probably why I'm so still hooked onto this work, and I think I will till my last breath. For someone that is also so intrigued by your work, can you tell us where they can find you? If you want to share your email or website, or any upcoming courses that you offer.
Sure. I'll be happy to correspond with anybody. You can send me an email. It's James Frazier now. That's NOW at gmail.com. And then my main website is neoshamanicshadow.com. But the best way, if you really want to have direct contact with me, is through that email, jamesfraziernow at gmail.com.
Okay, and we will add that to the notes. Thank you so much for joining us for our first conversations on our new channel, The Shadow Knows. And we're so grateful that you share your story and opening up this doorway into breathwork and Jungian coaching with us.
And we'd certainly like to invite you to return and help guide us into some deeper mysteries of the unconscious in some future episodes, because I think we're only just beginning.
If today's episode spoke to you, we'd love for you to subscribe, share the podcast, and join us again as we will continue to explore the hidden layers of the psyche.
Until next time, may you walk gently with your shadow, and may its wisdom guide you home. And remember, the shadow
Shadow
knows.
knows.